Good evening, everybody. I'm Nicole Gurran, Professor of Urban and Regional Planning here at the University of Sydney and Director of the Henry Halloran Urban and Regional Research Initiative. And before we go any further, of course, I'd like to acknowledge that we're here this evening on Gadigal country in the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land and to elders past, present and emerging. And in particular in this event about spatial justice and injustice, we must acknowledge the foundational spatial injustice on which this country has been founded and, that we are still to come to grips with. But I absolutely pay tribute to the extraordinary and ongoing advocacy work, fighting, incredible custodianship as well that's being continually enacted by our First Nations leaders who continue to work to overcome the legacies of this injustice. The Henry Halloran Urban and Regional Research Initiative doesn't quite roll off my tongue yet. That is the new name of the Henry Halloran, formerly known as the Henry Halloran Research Trust. We are a cross-disciplinary research centre here at the University of Sydney. We've been in operation for about 10 years now. Many of you, I can see, have come to many of our other events, including our annual Festival of Urbanism. We've got two missions, and you've probably heard me say them before, but I love saying them because I think they're so important. The first is to bring together all of the different bodies of knowledge across our university and other universities, from architecture, design and planning to science, to health, to public art, to politics, to economics, and to throw them at the really critical issues that face our cities and regions. And our second mission is to do that in communication and in dialogue with the profession, the built environment profession certainly, government, public policy makers, community leaders, and of course the wider community. And one of the important ways, of course, in which we do that is through events like tonight. So I've got great pleasure introducing, and I will introduce our speaker now, Professor Rolf Pendall, whose research I've been following for more than 2 decades, particularly on land use regulation and spatial justice. I'll give you a little flavour of his bio. He's Professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and his own mission is to learn and show how planners can contribute to greater spatial justice. He's had 35 years, that's hard to believe, Rolf, as a practitioner, scholar and teacher. And over that time he's researched and taught about how core planning domains, especially land use and housing policy, connect with harmful outcomes like urban sprawl and spatial injustice. Amongst Professor Pendall's very impactful research contributions, Professor Pendall also spent, I think, almost a decade at the Urban Institute in Washington, heading up the research on community development and housing. You can correct me later if I'm wrong. But I wanted to, about the timeline, about, your job title, but it was a very powerful role in a very important research institute that works at the interface between government, industry, and the many important advocacy and community-based bodies across the United States. And it gives a flavour for Professor Pendall's commitment not only to scholarship, but also to very impactful research informing policy and practice. So tonight's topic, of course, was always going to be of interest for us as planners in Australia concerned about spatial injustice. But given the recent political developments in the United States, talking about zoning, equity and diversity seems, dare I say it, almost dangerous, Rob. But But anyway, Rolf's going to talk to us for about 15 minutes with his prepared lecture. And then we've had some excellent questions that some of you have submitted, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A. We've arranged for a small reception afterwards, so do join us at 6 for some drinks and more conversation after that. But with that, I invite you up, Rolf.
I'm going to talk from here mostly because in light of, gosh, this is a really wide room, wide ranging, ranges from left to right. We don't get that wide a range in the United States often enough from far, well, whichever direction. So I wanted to start out by just saying thanks to Nicole for that kind introduction. I'm deeply grateful to the Henry Halloran Urban and Regional Research Initiative, which has generously made this visit possible, and to all of you for being here tonight. In my talk today, I'm going to start with some background about the role of planning in dividing metropolitan areas in the United States by race and class. Then I'll talk about 4 sets of planning and zoning reforms that are in play right now in the United States that aim to reverse the harms of segregation. This photo is a composite that represents extremes of wealth and poverty that one can find in many U.S. metro areas. You'd never see a scene like this in real life, of course, because planning keeps neighborhoods like these kilometers apart from one another. Chicago, near my campus, is a famous example of such levels of segregation. Let me orient you to the colors on this map, and apologize to anyone who has color issues. The scattered light brown dots on this map represent white people, white non-Hispanic people. The yellow ones represent black people. The aqua dots, Hispanic people, and bright blue dots, Asian people. It doesn't take a lot of fancy statistics just to know from looking at the map that Chicago is a deeply segregated metropolitan area by race. It's also evident from this map, which shows people in lowest income brackets in reds and the highest income brackets in blues, that Chicago is also deeply segregated by income. And not only that, it's getting more segregated by income over time, with the left-hand map being 1970 and the right-hand map being 2010. At the same scale, Chicago is sprawling outward and upper income people are both moving out. And you may be able to see also that in the center of Chicago, there are neighborhoods that have been getting much more affluent, even as many other neighborhoods in Chicago are becoming poorer. Residential segregation is not just a curiosity, it's harmful not only to people who live in neighborhoods that don't receive investment because white and affluent people don't live there, but also to entire metropolitan areas. About 10 years ago, when I was at the Urban Institute, I worked with a group of colleagues in Chicago on this study which estimated the metropolitan level impacts of segregation on multiple dimensions of regional quality of life. The study, which was based on 3 decades of data from the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the United States, allowed us to conclude that if Chicago had just the national level, median level of segregation, instead of the 3rd highest in the United States, people living there would have earned over $4 billion more in income in 2010 alone, that the region would have had 83,000 more college graduates, and that it would have lost 30% fewer people to homicide in 2010. These are the independent impacts of high levels of economic and racial segregation on these important outcomes, not just for the people who live in those neighborhoods, but for the entire region. So that is, segregation is harmful to everyone, to entire metropolitan areas. Unfortunately, planners in the United States are deeply complicit in these high levels of residential segregation. From 1900 or before to at least 1970, planners worked carefully and closely with engineers, lawyers, and real estate professionals to develop and carry out land use plans, zoning ordinances, highway plans, urban renewal programs, public housing systems, and other initiatives that resulted in this level of harmful segregation. The result of this history is that today you can build a single-family house almost anywhere in the U.S. This map is from the National Zoning Atlas, which is an ambitious effort to create a nationally consistent zoning map of the whole U.S. This is really hard to do in the United States, unlike in New South Wales, because the U.S. has tens of thousands of cities, villages, towns, townships, and counties whose state governments allow them broad latitude in planning and zoning. So everybody has their own categories, and they often have multiple categories that mean practically the same thing. It's really hard to work your way around one of these zoning ordinances and maps, and that's been kind of refreshing since getting here, that I can look at the same map and know that it means one thing all the way from the Blue Mountains to Parramatta and to the northern municipalities. Sorry, I call them municipalities, it's my language. That's the way that I use my language. The picture from the previous slide, though, this is the same area, looks radically different when it comes to zoning, even for small apartment buildings, the ones with 4 or more dwelling units. Southern New England is kind of extreme in this respect, but it's not qualitatively different from most of the rest of the United States. Throughout the U.S., even major cities have few areas that are zoned for multifamily housing. Some suburbs have none at all. Now, zoning has worked this way in the U.S. for a century because so many people believe that apartments are like parasites that suck all the good things out of entire sections of private houses. That judgment in that language goes back at least a century to a landmark 1926 Supreme Court case that validated exclusive zones for single-family houses. In fact, this case, Euclid versus Ambler, is the fundamental zoning course, the zoning case that every practicing planner knows and that every planning student learns about. It gives us the power to do zoning in the United States, even though it affects private property values. Zoning is considered to be a legitimate exercise of the local police power. That is the power to regulate on behalf of public health, safety, and welfare. So this is kind of the case that you're going to be asked about in the licensing exams and so on, and it's often cited with a lot of approval because it gives that kind of local control. So it's not just a random case, I guess I'm trying to underscore here a bit. And ever since 1926, local zoning ordinances have been designed in large part to keep apartments away from single-family detached houses and therefore to keep renters away from homeowners in the U.S. Because for the most part, multifamily housing in the U.S. is rented, much more so than here, and renters live, for the most part, in apartments, not in single-family houses. Meanwhile, the limited number of areas where apartments are allowed often expose tenants to pollution and noise. This was true historically in the Chicago public housing high-rises that were built along the Dan Ryan Expressway in the 1960s and demolished 4 decades later. And it's true now in many metro areas, including Los Angeles, where 1.2 million people live within 150 meters of a freeway like this gentleman here, whose view includes 8 lanes of traffic, 4 in either direction. On the, I think this is well, I don't know, it's just one of those massive numbered highways. Has anybody here ever driven on one of those LA freeways? Okay, a couple people. You know what it's like. Sorry, going backwards. Areas where renters and low-income homeowners are concentrated also tend to have lower quality public services than neighboring areas with more affluent residents. These schools in Detroit are an extreme example of this. In 2019, Detroit schools had no funding to pay for $500 million they needed in repairs to be safe and healthy. And meanwhile, just over the border in Grosse Pointe, children who grow up in neighborhoods that are protected and made more expensive by exclusionary zoning enjoy upgraded facilities paid for by a healthy local tax base that only keeps on getting better because exclusionary zoning raises the price of housing there, and the schools further contribute. So what I'm describing here is a pattern of mutual reinforcement in which you have a divide between Detroit and Grosse Pointe, in which families who can afford to leave Detroit do so, reducing Detroit's wealth, vitality, and tax base, and the families who live in Grosse Pointe enjoy rising property values because their schools have a gold-plated reputation. And in Detroit, but even more so in Chicago, Washington, D.C., and other large cities with hot housing markets, gentrifiers discover that some of these struggling neighborhoods have unique architecture, interesting and walkable streets, and access to rail transit. Soon, some incumbent residents can't afford to stay in their neighborhoods, and those who stay might eventually feel lost in neighborhoods they once called home. But in the past 15 years, I've witnessed a shift in mainstream planning in the United States. Planners are now much more aware of racial and economic inequity on average. They're also committed to reversing it. It would take a much longer talk to unpack all the reasons for this shift in planning, but some of the reasons are the election of President Obama, federal grant programs during his administration, and that of President Biden that stressed regional equity, generational shifts, and the Black Lives Matter movement, which draws attention to the state-sanctioned violence that segregation exacerbates. Also, many more planners recognize today that segregation isn't a result of individual choices or accidents, but that we built it on purpose. This is thanks in part to Richard Rothstein's terrific 2017 book, The Color of Law, which documents chapter after chapter the many interlocking mechanisms that helped segregate the U.S. over the course of more than a century. Having seen that planners segregated the U.S. on purpose, we also see that we must work, and we can work at least as hard for the next century to reverse the harms of segregation. Between 2017, and I think the timing may be a little bit of a coincidence here, but not entirely, because it's all of a piece of over the course of the 20-teens. But between 2017 and 2019, a task force put together by the American Planning Association drafted this policy guide, which the APA Board of Directors formally ratified as APA's adopted position in 2019. So APA is to the United States as the PIA, the Planning Institute of Australia, is to Australia. It is really the main organization of mainstream planning in the United States that was created, in fact, out of and within the context of that planning for white supremacy in the early 1900s. The document, and so this is formally adopted policy. It's not just like a toolkit or some other. You should know about these things if you're interested. The document cites a longstanding element of the Code of Ethics of the American Institute of Certified Planners that all planners must ensure that proposed policies and regulations will serve and benefit all residents of a community in ways that reduce or eliminate inequity. Given the breadth of this institutional commitment, APA endorses an equity in all policies approach. For the remainder of my talk, though, I'm not going to talk about every single area of policy. I'm going to focus on 4 groups of reforms to land use planning, zoning, and housing, highlighting examples from a few states and cities that have been ahead of the curve in advancing equity through their plans. The first group of programs concerns planning and zoning for affordable housing. And this is where the images on my slides kind of disappear. So sorry about that, but it's kind of hard to find images to accompany some of these ideas. California, as an example, requires all of its local governments to adopt long-range comprehensive plans, which are called general plans there. And each of these plans have to include a chapter or an element, it's the same thing, on housing. Each housing element has to include programs and actions to address the current and future housing needs of people ranging from the most indigent to the most affluent. This mandate has been strengthened in recent years, including a 2021 requirement that local governments to commit to desegregation. Before that time, you could have programs, for example, for very low-income households, and those programs and the maps that went with them could put all of the housing in one area of town, as long as you said we have space for them, it doesn't matter where they go. Well, now it matters where they go since 2021, and we'll see what impact that has. This is one of the most famous programs in the United States. Maybe some of you have even heard about it, the Montgomery County Moderately Priced Dwelling Unit Program, adopted in 1974 as one of the nation's first inclusionary zoning programs. Since then, it's resulted in over 13,000 affordable housing units that are mixed into market rate apartment buildings and subdivisions in neighborhoods all over the state's most populous county. About 1 million people live in Montgomery County. It's right outside Washington, D.C. Some of these dwellings are owned and operated in perpetuity as public housing. Others become available for rental or sale to market rate residents after 15 to 30 years. The second group of programs is newer to the United States, but they're probably closer to conventional practice in Australia than housing plan mandates and inclusionary zoning here. Momentum has been building to erode or end single-family only zoning, which, as I've noted and stressed, is the corner of U.S. land use regulation since the early 1900s. Several states have preempted local government's ability to exclude accessory dwellings. Oregon is one example, but California has been working on this for decades. Montana, a surprising state for this to happen in, it's deeply conservative, it's sort of a libertarian conservative state, passed a law in 2023 to zone duplexes into single family districts. This is kind of, again, it's kind of a big deal in Montana for this to happen. Oregon's law redefines single family zones to include triplexes, quads, and cottage courts, which you can look up online if you're interested in seeing some examples of that. Maybe that's where I could have worked in a picture. Well, next time. These new preemption laws responded at first mainly to concerns over segregation. This is especially true in Minneapolis, where a grassroots group concerned about segregation called Neighbors for More Neighbors organized to demand triplexes and single-family zones in the city's 2019 comprehensive plan update. Since then, ending single-family only zoning has gained popularity across the United States, but more as a route to encourage or increase affordability through expanded supply than to integrate neighborhoods. A third group of programs aims to allow low-income communities to survive and thrive. These encompass an array of initiatives to forestall gentrification. For example, Chicago passed a law recently that keeps very high-income families from purchasing 2 to 4 unit buildings in transit-rich, mixed-income neighborhoods and turning them into in-town mansions. This was happening quite a lot. I see some nods in the audience, so maybe that's happening here too. Yeah. They call that anti-deconversion. Isn't that a really weird word? You know, because they were never built for, well, anyway. Other anti-gentrification measures include plan and zoning districts to limit redevelopment and turnover in historically black neighborhoods in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and Beaufort County, South Carolina. I think I'd pause here to mention that there might be a conflict here between the desire to upzone a lot of single-family neighborhoods with essentially low density housing in them, and to maintain the character of neighborhoods where communities have been living for a long time, who've been denied access into other parts of the same city, and now they're threatened with gentrification, displacement, removal, and so on. So there are places and areas in which zoning for supply and zoning for equity may come into conflict. Another group of programs would allow community businesses to operate more easily. For example, community kitchens, doing commercial food operations, farmers markets, and other things are really rigidly controlled in a lot of cities, and especially in suburbs. And some of these reforms are also about that. So again, this group of programs and policies is really aimed not at integrating the upper income neighborhoods, but preserving the integrity and the ability to stay of the people who already live in neighborhoods that are suddenly well situated and that could thrive even more. Okay, well, the final group of programs is about reversing environmental justice. These programs are somewhat newer. California in 2021 began to require its local governments in 2021 to adopt environmental justice elements, again, as part of their comprehensive plans. And so as of that year, local governments in California have been adopting strategies and committing to programs to reduce environmental injustice, situations like the ones that you see pictured in the report on the right. This report is a recent report by my colleague and collaborator, Chris Quattro. I highly recommend it. If you can get your hands on it, it's another planning advisory service report from the American Planning Association. Sacramento is acting on its report already to reduce permitted industrial and trucking land uses in historically disenfranchised neighborhoods. But as I said a moment ago, there may be goal conflicts, and this is another area in which there might be a conflict. I mentioned a few minutes ago that there are a lot of apartments that line the freeways in Los Angeles, but how is Southern California going to meet its affordable housing needs, its housing supply needs, and clear those corridors away and keep people safe from pollution and noise? Hopefully we don't have to wait for the complete electrification of the U.S. car fleet, because I think some people have in mind that that's never going to happen. Before finishing, I think it's important to draw your attention to this policy guide. I mentioned the Equity and Planning Policy Guide a little bit ago. The American Planning Association did the same thing with this guide, which I think is better than the Planning for Equity Policy Guide that I mentioned earlier. This is widely available. You can easily find it just by Googling Equity and Zoning Policy Guide. I'd strongly recommend it as it includes quite a few of the policies that I've talked about tonight, but also many more beyond those. And I'd be interested to know whether people here think that they might be applicable in Australia as well. So in summary, just to cap this thing off again, it's clear to me and a lot of people who observe planning in the United States that it helped create American apartheid. It was built in the early 1900s at a time when eugenics was legitimate science, when eugenics dominated much conversation in the United States and elsewhere. And I think it's time to end that, and a lot of planners agree. So the strategies that I've gone through here would allow us to do more about that by planning and zoning for affordable housing, by overturning single-family only zoning, by allowing low-income communities to survive and thrive, and by reversing environmental justice. Thanks very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Rolf. You've prompted so many thoughts and questions in my own mind, I'm sure, with the audience. I'm going to stay here for the sake of the microphone, but I am going to invite you to take a tall chair, being mic'd up. I want to start just with a couple of the questions that were sent in advance, but we are going to have plenty of time for this group to ask questions. So just start to signal me in a moment, get your questions queued up, and then start to signal to me. And we've got a microphone which we'll use. It helps us with recording. But look, to start with, I'm going to go to a question by Thomas Walters, if you don't mind. I don't know if Thomas is here, but I hope he doesn't mind me naming him. And I'm going to read it out because it's... Oh, thanks, Thomas. Do you mind? And I actually want to read out your question because I think it's really great. And for me, it sort of sums up the way that we in Australia have grown up really looking at American literature, and our cities, in fact, in many ways have been so shaped by ideas and actual, patterns and design from the United States. But when they've been transported here, they have landed in a slightly different context. So Thomas writes, he prepared a university essay on the topic of spatial injustice and found that early 20th century exclusionary zoning in the United States was also supported by racially motivated local council legislation, as you mentioned, Rolf, bank red zoning, redlining, and societal attitudes. Now, the second part of So that's his statement. I was actually going to ask you to elaborate slightly more on that, because we did have another question trying to tease that out, actually, whether it was more planners or more the bank's redlining practices. So we might get you to answer that first, and then we'll go back to the second part of Thomas's question, which was actually, is there a movement by those same institutions to support desegregation? So not only by planners, but also banks and other institutions. But I actually want to push you a little bit more on the question by Nick, actually, Nick Loader, if you're here, Nick. But Nick asking, really, was it the planners, and was it all planners, or was it, an explicit, conscious part of the early urban planning, or more the banks?
Well, I'm delighted to start with that history question. I actually teach the planning history and theory class to the intro master's students at the University of Illinois, and I think I come to realize that people have until recently thought about the 1960s as being the time when finally the progressives, the people who wanted a more humane version of urban planning, they suddenly appeared on the scene, almost out of nowhere. And if you look back at the history, it's in fact as early as the settlement house movement, which I know had its manifestations here too, in fact very close to the University of Sydney, if I'm not wrong. The settlement house workers, including Jane Addams and the people who started Hull House in Chicago, very famous. So Jane Addams won a Nobel Peace Prize. She was a social philosopher, an economist, really a remarkable person and thinker. She was working in Chicago, alongside a lot of other people who were involved in the peace movement, but also in the settlement house movement. Those folks were deeply involved in the formation of early city planning. The very first conference, the National Conference on City Planning, it happened in 1909, included both these kind of social progressives, the social reformers, as well as the lawyers and the business people and the real estate executives who wanted to control the city. And they kind of mixed it up a bit at that first conference. Well, there's one character named Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. who did not like these reformers a bit. And he took control of the second National Congress on city planning, and essentially disinvited all of the social reformers from that conference. So the answer is, it goes back a long way, and it was a very deliberate attempt to sort of pick sides between social reform and building cities that worked for real estate, and especially that worked to allow upper income, mostly white people to buy single family houses in neighborhoods in suburban areas. So to ask the question, was it the planners or was it real estate and banks? It's really all part of the same professional crowd at that point in the early 19-teens. The early people who were calling themselves professional planners, they're very connected, and the self-definition, even today, of planners who are more reform-oriented, more housing-oriented. I have a good colleague whose master's degree and Ph.D. are both in planning. He teaches housing policy. He calls himself a houser. He doesn't call himself a planner, because there's still this sort of idea that to call oneself a planner is to align oneself with that period of history. Was it planners' fault? Well, calling something as complicated as racial segregation and economic segregation the responsibility or fault of any one group of people, of course not. It's no one person's fault. People talk about racial capitalism. I mean, that's the formation out of which our country, the United States, grew. I don't know enough about Australian history to sort of know how to cast Australian history in the same way. But for certain, the United States was built on the labor of enslaved people over generations, over centuries, and over stolen land from indigenous people. That's a whole system. It's not just one profession that does that. Planners play our role, but planners in the US are probably a lot weaker than they'd like to be, and a lot weaker than many people think they are. I like to highlight planners' role because, in part because planners often didn't say no, or the people who were calling themselves planners didn't say no, and others were opting into other areas. So it's kind of a long answer, but it's a complex question that I think deserves kind of a longish answer. Did I answer it?
Yeah, and it's very salutary as well, isn't it, for planners now to wonder how we might be viewed in future and how we might be characterised. I can see Sue's got...
The idea that you're going to show up in a neighbourhood and say, I'm from the planning department, I'm here to help you, I don't know if that holds water here in Australia, but it definitely does in many communities in the United States. Sorry to...
I'm going to allow Sue Weatherby to make an interjection, and then we'll get back to the second part of Thomas's question. Sue.
Oh, yeah, Mike is coming.
Yeah, so I'm the president of the Planning Institute of Australia, the New South Wales division. And when I hear the conversation about, the contribution planners have made, I sometimes think, that's a really hard characterisation. And I think you've made that point. But it's also about, in small municipalities, community influencing councillors making decisions about, we're not going to upzone land. One of the first interactions I had with when I was working at RIDE, the mayor said to me, because I was talking to him about affordable housing processes, and he said, Sue, it's not our job to provide affordable housing, it's our job to make sure people's house prices go up. And so within a system, planners have to operate within a system that doesn't always support the vision that a planner might have, or their desire for reform, or their knowledge or perception that there could be something different, because ultimately the decision about how land is zoned and what policies are in place are not the planners, they're actually the politicians. Certainly in New South Wales, it's politicians who make all those decisions, who are influenced by more often by existing communities than they are by the future communities that really we're planning for. So I suppose the question, I've sort of got around this, but I was really interested in your view about, the fact that it operates within a political environment, and how much impact do you think in the US, that political environment also sets out what happens in terms of zoning equity or spatial equity?
Well, the politics is everything, but politics happens over multiple time scales and over multiple spatial scales. I would not have been able to get up here and give you this talk 15 years ago. And as I mentioned, there have been a series of historic events in the United States that have allowed people to see things differently, that have allowed people to organize at the state level sometimes, at the local level sometimes, so that you have movements like Neighbors for More Neighbors in Minneapolis that are motivated by a desire to come to grips with racial zoning.
So no one can hear you because you don't have the microphone. But I'm actually going to ask you to hold that thought, because the second part of the question actually picked up the politics, and I think it's worth answering that. And then we might do one more question, and then let's come back to the generation, and then free for all. I want hands, I want questions, I want possibly some comments. So the second part of Thomas's question does pick up the politics. And Thomas asked whether you think the movement for change might also be supported by some of those other institutions who also play a role in development. So the banks, real estate, and also, of course, the political constituents who presumably, exercise strong power over the planners.
Well, their politics matters too. 5 years ago, I would have said, yeah. In fact, I was seeing it in well, not exactly 5 years ago, but 4 years ago. In the fall of 2020, all these commitments were coming from bank after mortgage company after real estate agent association and so on to address racism in the United States because a man named George Floyd was murdered by a police officer in Minneapolis. And I know there were Black Lives Matter rallies all over the world. And that the momentum behind that, the political momentum, but also the commercial and social momentum behind doing something about it at that point was, it was shockingly fast to me. And it's been incredibly dispiriting to me over the subsequent years to see how effective an organized campaign to push back and then some against those gains has gained ground. There's legislation called the Community Reinvestment Act, for example, that passed in 1977. It's not really strong, but it's gradually gotten stronger since then at the national level. It requires lending institutions to make loans in neighborhoods, essentially in low-income neighborhoods. It's more complicated than that, but I'll spare you the details. We're looking at the possibility of the gutting of that legislation. The banks have been trying for a while. They wouldn't have been able to get away with it in late 2020, but they're going after it hammer and tongs. And the current administration has support for rolling back gains that were made immediately on the, in the wake of the death of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. So the political situation now is extremely challenging. I am going back. I do have all my paperwork in order. I know this is being recorded. I'm not that afraid yet, but it's because I'm a citizen and because I'm a white man, and I have the protection of those statuses behind me that I feel comfortable enough to talk about these things. But I have graduate students who I'm sure are concerned now, and they should be, because of the unauthorized detention of people whose names, well, I don't know, I won't go into it, but if any of you are following the news, if you're not following the news, I hope you will a bit, because it's terribly troubling for the state of science, for the state of learning and knowledge, and for human progress, I guess I think of it.
Greta, I might ask you to give Sue the mic. And Sue, you've got the option of restating what you're going to say or answering this question, which I think is actually better directed to Sue than to Rolf in your role as president of Yes. And Ros Palmer's asked whether Australia inherited the inequity in our zoning patterns and whether any attention's been given to rectifying it.
It's probably not as overt as what's being described.
Is the mic on?
Is that a bit better? Okay. I'll speak up as well. So I was going to say, I don't think it's quite as overt. I mean, but it's absolutely, there is, within places such as Sydney, Melbourne, our major cities, there is spatial inequity. People, we give it fancy names. We call it about the latte line or something where beyond a certain line, certain area of Sydney, access to jobs, education, and other facilities and services is a lot lower than other parts of Sydney. We also know that there's some council areas, the councils have had a long program of keeping the poor people out, and they do that by not making objecting to any change to zoning that they can. The actions of the state government of the last year or so, through some intentional upzonings, significant upzonings in areas, and generally we don't now have a zone that's even close to a single home zone in Sydney. There's a minimum. It's got duplexes and some of it's got small residential flat buildings as well. So, but that was done because councils wouldn't do it. And that, having worked in local government in New South Wales for 30 odd years, that primarily was because there was no political will to do so. And there is a clear spatial inequity in New South Wales. Particularly in Sydney, you can draw the line on a map. You can see
So
it.
I might start to get hands now for people who've got questions. And as you're raising your hands, great, I want to pick up as well just to jog some questions. We do have upzoning, but not necessarily leading to, for instance, an affordable housing outcome, which of course was one of the themes that Rolf
Classic example of this is
raised.
over 10 years ago, it was recommended to the state government that they have inclusionary zoning. That was what the first draft of the Metropolis of Three Cities plan did. And it didn't make the final version of that plan. And it was at the time when property cycle was going gangbusters in Sydney. We lost 10 years of affordable housing.
Real estate agents or planners or who else? Question there, and then we've got a question over there. So we'll start to make them quick now.
And can you tell me who you are before you start?
Yeah, sure. Speak loudly. I'm Caroline, and you spoke a lot about reforms, particularly to single dwellings, and they seem recent and quite new in America. What are you going to be looking at? And it might be signals, it might be as precise as metrics to understand the impact of these reforms, particularly against the kind of goal conflict situations you spoke about.
So I think the question, as I understand it, because I think the mic may not be connected all that well to the speaker system. The question is, are there efforts to track the impacts of these reforms? And the answer is, it varies a lot from one state to the next. Like Australia, the US is a federal system. So for example, California has been enacting a lot of reforms over the last, I don't know, probably 20 years. In fact, I got my start studying affordable housing policy as right after my master's degree, studying affordable housing policy and writing snarky notes to local governments to tell them they should be zoning for more affordable housing in the Bay Area. So that didn't get very far. It was 1990, and if they'd only listened to me then. And so some of the more recent laws have in fact had monitoring and evaluation attached to them. But planners in the US, I don't know about Australia, but planners in the US are just not very good at looking backwards and making sure we evaluate, or even track and monitor and enable ourselves to track what has been done, not to mention what the impacts of what's been done have been. And in part, it's a hard scientific problem, because a lot of places that start reforming then tinker and they tinker and they tinker. And so you have this long chain of reforms, right? And what are the impacts of this particular change versus the whole trajectory of change that happens? And is the policy change causing the change in the housing market, or is the housing market change causing the change in the policy, right? So to me, it's really interesting, because I view, and I think probably most of you would agree, that these sort of policies and housing markets, they're complex adaptive systems, and it takes a different kind of structure to evaluate the workings of a complex adaptive system than it does like a lab treatment on a new drug. And yet many people want to treat zoning reform, for example, as if it were as simple to study as, do we have the placebo or do we have the treatment, right? It's practically never that clean. Hope that answers your question. I do think it's worth tracking, absolutely, and telling the story, but the storytelling and the narrative building about what happened, when, and how, from a sort of a deep historical standpoint, I think is much more illuminating than it is to see here's 100 local governments that adopted the same thing or something slightly different at a time, and 100 that didn't, and what was the average impact of this versus that. That, to me, it doesn't tell you as much as getting really deep in the weeds and seeing who said what to whom and what happened and then what happened first. So anyway, it's sort of but it's a question for policymakers too, right? It's not just for like academics to be interested in. Policymakers need to know the histories of other places and the people stories from the other places in order to figure out like what should we do next and what can we expect from our policies.
Yeah, we won't get any evidence-based reform if we don't measure the impacts of what we do. Question there, and then let me know if anyone else has a question.
Testing. Hello. I'll just speak really loud as well. So my name's Evelyn, and I had a question about the environmental injustice and reversing that. So when there's a big climate catastrophe, especially like flooding in Lismore for people who know, and bushfires out in the Blue Mountains, I often think, who let them build there? And why do people keep rebuilding? I think about the cost of insurance, who has to pay that, etc. And I guess for those instances, the people who live in that area would know about it, and often they live there because that's their community. But when I look at urban heat in Sydney, in Western Sydney, it can get up to 20 degrees warmer on a hot day than it is on the coast. And so to me, that's inequity, because all the housing developments there, they don't do anything to prevent it. They're all black roofs, a metre apart. It's shocking. But we need houses, as we've established. But when we were looking at some of the policies you mentioned on reversing environmental injustice in California particularly, what sort of reforms, like what sort of things do they think about when they're trying to reverse it and balance that with housing? So basically, whose job is it to ensure it happens? Like, who does the onus fall on, is my question.
So I think there's dealing with the injustices of the past, and then there's preventing the issues in the future, right? So when we're thinking about how to deal with the issues in the past, the Sacramento zoning ordinance that I mentioned, that's more about industrial pollution and too much proximity between low-income neighborhoods and industrial uses. I believe what they're undertaking is amortizing all of the industrially polluting businesses and saying you have another 5 years or another 10 years to continue operating, and at that point you have to finish. So according to U.S. property law, you can't just say you can't operate anymore. It's very complicated to go into court and win in that kind of a situation. But there are a lot of good precedents for saying, we're going to address this conflict between a private use and another private use in which it's no longer appropriate, or we know something about that level of environmental pollution that we didn't before, or we know that we have to deal with it now in ways that we didn't have to before, even if we did know about it, right? So there are situations that are like that, but when you have like a massive, difficult to pin down situation like heat in Western Sydney, that's going to take like a massive commitment to justice on a lot of different levels to overcome. It can't just fall on the planning system. It has to be parks. It has to be probably housing retrofits. And a lot of that, if you're going to really address it comprehensively, I would talk this way about the United States too. There are so many people who live in old houses that are making them sick, that are making them fall down and trip. And these, especially older adults, are falling down and tripping and, tripping, falling down, breaking bones, ending up in the hospital with pneumonia and dying early, imposing all kinds of costs throughout the system. It would be much more economically wise to go into their houses and retrofit them for energy efficiency and for safety than it would to just allow all of these problems to be handled by families and by the healthcare system. So it's, that is absolutely a problem that's way bigger than the land use planning system, but it's not bigger than public policy if the imagination is there to work on it. So that's, I hope that's sort of both high level enough and specific enough to satisfy the question. Is it?
Look, I'm going to say thank you for raising the environmental justice question. I think it's one that we don't really have a great language or policy framework for analysing. It's certainly understudied and under-acknowledged in, in land use planning, policy and in education.
And it's early days in the United States too, right? This requirement in California planning law, it was enacted less than 10 years ago, and if that's true in California, then it's going to be true elsewhere in the United States.
But there's great potential, for instance, to bring together, for instance, health science to highlight, the health risks of, particular land use decisions that are being, baked in to our built environment, not to mention the past injustices that are coming to light now, around Jervis Bay, water quality, and of course the climate exposure.